We've been talking about the doctrine of creation, and particularly the creation-evolution controversy. And last time I argued that even if the natural scientist has to work within the constraints of methodological naturalism, no such constraint governs the work of the systematic theologian. And therefore, the systematic theologian is free to pursue theological hypotheses as well as naturalistic ones in trying to understand the origin of life and of biological complexity. As Christians, we want to have a theology or worldview that takes account of and integrates both the biblical data and the scientific evidence in the most plausible worldview possible, and there's no reason that we should be constrained by naturalism in crafting such a worldview. So we want to turn now to the subject of the origin of life. What does the scientific evidence indicate about how life originated on this planet? Now, earlier in discussing the fine-tuning of the universe, we saw that in order for life to exist anywhere in the universe, there have to be these exquisitely, finely tuned constants and quantities present in the Big Bang as initial conditions. And these initial conditions are required for the existence and evolution of life anywhere in the cosmos. In the absence of the fine-tuning of these initial conditions, there wouldn't even be galaxies, there wouldn't be stars, there wouldn't be planets where life could evolve and exist. But even given those exquisitely fine-tuned initial conditions, that's no guarantee that life is going to evolve somewhere in the cosmos. Those conditions are necessary for life to originate, but they are not sufficient. These are necessary but not sufficient conditions for the existence and evolution of life. In order for life to originate somewhere in the universe, other conditions have to be in place, and these also turn out to be astronomically improbable. If you're like me, you were probably taught in high school or in grade school that the way that life originated on Earth is through the chemical interactions in the so-called primordial soup, chance chemical reactions in the early oceans, perhaps fueled by lightning strikes, originated living organisms. Back in the 1950s, a graduate student named Stanley Miller was able to synthesize amino acids in the laboratory by passing electric sparks through a methane gas in one of his experimental apparatuses in the laboratory. So he was able to obtain amino acids by electrical charges passed through the methane gas. Now, amino acids aren't alive, but proteins are made out of amino acids. And proteins are found in living things, and so the hope was that somehow the origin of life might be explained on the basis of these chemical reactions. Now, you might be saying to yourself, that seems like a pretty big extrapolation. He was able to get amino acids. Amino acids make up proteins. Proteins are made of amino acids. Proteins are found in living things. Therefore, living things can be explained through chemical evolution. And I would agree with you. I think that is a pretty big extrapolation, really something that goes so far beyond the evidence as to be a non sequitur. But nevertheless, that is what most of us were taught, right? In the primordial soup that covered the earth, in the warm oceans, or else perhaps in pools that were isolated, through lightning strikes and chemical reactions, somehow primitive life was birthed and formed. Now, what you may not know is that all of these old chemical origin of life scenarios have broken down and are now widely rejected by the scientific community. This point was documented very well in a book several years ago called The Mystery of Life's Origin by Charles Thaxton, Walter Bradley, and Roger Olson. They point out that there probably never even was such a thing as the primordial soup, because the natural processes of destruction and dilution that would go on in the oceans would have prevented the chemical reactions that supposedly led to life. You see, Miller's experiments were performed in a highly controlled laboratory environment, in a little glass-enclosed artificial environment where the natural processes of destruction and dilution could be screened out and so wouldn't come into effect. But of course, in the primordial oceans of the earth, these kinds of destructive processes wouldn't be screened out, and they would have prevented the chemical reactions that would supposedly have led to the formation of life. Thaxton, Bradley, and Olson also point out that thermodynamics poses an insuperable problem for these chemical origin of life scenarios, because there just isn't any way to harness the raw energy of lightning or the sun in order to drive chemical evolution forward. There just isn't any mechanism that would take this raw energy and transform it and harness it in such a way as to forward chemical evolution toward life. Moreover, they point out that there is no way in nature to preserve any of the products of chemical evolution for the supposed next step in the process. A scientist like Stanley Miller can artificially isolate the products of the first chemical development. He can isolate those little amino acids that have been formed in his flask and then subject them to a second step. But in the primordial seas, there wasn't any way of collecting and isolating and preserving any of the products of chemical evolution for the supposed next step. And so the same processes that formed these substances in the first place would almost immediately destroy them again. And finally, the last point that they make is that it was originally believed that billions of years, literally billions of years, were available for life to originate through these chemical processes. Given billions of years, there would be in the oceans billions and billions and billions of chances for life to originate in the primordial soup. The problem is that we now have fossil evidence of life that goes back as far as 3.8 billion years. Life has already existed on this planet from 3.8 billion years ago. Now, when you think that the age of the Earth is somewhere around 5 to 6 billion years old, that means that the window of opportunity between the time that the Earth cooled down enough and the seas formed and the appearance of the first life is being progressively closed. This window of opportunity for life to originate is getting narrower and narrower and narrower. You have to have the Earth cool down, form the oceans, and then you've got this increasingly narrow window of opportunity before we already have life on Earth. In fact, Bradley, Thaxton, and Olson estimate that this window of opportunity is probably only about 25 million years in duration, during which life had to originate by chemical evolution. And that's far too short a time for these naturalistic scenarios to occur by chance. There would need to be some sort of miraculous intervention in order for life to originate in so relatively short a time. And so for all of these reasons and more, these old chemical origin of life scenarios have broken down. And instead today there is a plethora of alternative speculative theories with no consensus on the horizon. Now, I'm not going to survey these, but if you're interested in seeing a very, very nice survey, take a look at the Wikipedia article on origin of life. And it will describe many of these different speculative scenarios about how life originated on this planet, none of which has shown to be tenable. Steve Meyer, in his recent book, Signature in the Cell, Steve Meyer, in his Signature in the Cell, says that the odds of getting even a single functioning protein molecule by chance, and remember, that's not even alive. We're not talking here about a cell. He's talking about a single functioning protein molecule. The odds of this are about 1 chance out of 10 to the 64th power. Just an inconceivable number. He says that's a trillion, 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 trillion times smaller than the odds of finding a single specified particle among all the possible particles in the universe. So take all the particles in the universe and you go pick out one. What are the odds you're going to get just that one? Well, they're a trillion, 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 trillion times higher than these odds, which are the odds for a single protein molecule. This is on page 212 of Signature in the Cell, in case you're interested. He says protein function depends upon hundreds of specifically sequenced amino acids, and the odds of a single functional protein arising by chance are prohibitively low given the probabilistic resources of the entire universe. So not just the probabilistic resources of Earth's primordial oceans, but the probabilistic resources of the entire universe. The odds of getting a single functional protein molecule are prohibitively small. And therefore, some theorists today are wondering whether we'll ever really be able to discover the answer to how life on this planet originated. In an article in the Cell Biology International, Trevors and Abel say, and I quote, "New approaches to investigating the origin of the genetic code are required. The constraints of historical science are such that the origin of life may never be understood." We may never know the answer. The origin of life on Earth thus remains inexplicable as current science stands today. Francis Crick, who was the co-discoverer of DNA, once said that the origin of life on the Earth is, and I quote, "almost a miracle," end quote. And in fact, Crick was driven to the position that the origin of life on Earth is so improbable that it probably didn't originate here. He thinks that it was probably seeded from some other planet elsewhere in the universe, where life originated, and then life came here already formed. So that life didn't evolve on this planet through chemical evolution. It came full form from some other planet elsewhere in the universe. But of course, that just pushes the question back a notch and leaves you wondering, well, where did that life, that extraterrestrial life, come from? And of course, that's an unfalsifiable hypothesis. We have no way of verifying or falsifying that. Well, as I said earlier, the Bible doesn't say how life originated. It just says, God said, let the land bring forth vegetation. Let the waters swarm with fish and other life. The Bible isn't a science book. It doesn't tell us what means God used to create life, or if he used any means at all, rather than miraculous intervention. But I think we can certainly say safely that the origin of life on this planet is consistent with, in Francis Crick's words, saying that the origin of life is a miracle. That is to say, it's an event which was supernaturally brought about by God. Minimally, we can say that the science and the Bible are not in contradiction on this issue. And indeed, if anything, I think that science is clearer that the origin of life is due to some sort of supernatural designer or miraculous intervention than the Bible is. So that on the basis of modern science, one might well conclude that the origin of life requires some sort of supernatural designing intelligence and creator. Now, we're out of time, so next time we meet, we'll take any questions you have about this, and then we'll begin to look at the origin of biological complexity. How did that simple, unicellular first organism evolve into the complex and rich diversity of life forms that we see today?